Every Catholic knows where the Rosary came from. A forest outside Toulouse, 1214. Saint Dominic on his knees, defeated by the Albigensian heresy, and the Virgin Mary appearing above him to place a string of beads in his hands. It is painted on church walls across Europe. It is in the breviary. The trouble is that nobody described that scene until 1470, 250 years after Dominic was in the ground. The Rosary did not come down from heaven, it came up from the Psalms. Hold on to that date. 1470, everything bends around it. Begin with what is missing, because the absence here is louder than anything anyone said. Dominic de Guzman died at Bologna in the year 1221. Within a generation his order had produced 8 or 9 lives of him. Not one of them mentions the Rosary. The witnesses called to testify at his canonization, men who had walked with him and eaten with him and buried him, say nothing about beads. Examine the early constitutions of the Dominican provinces, many of which have been printed. Nothing. Examine the great collection of Dominican charters and deeds assembled in the 19th century. Nothing there either. Then there are the manuscripts. We possess thousands of sermons, chronicles, treatises, and saints' lives, written by the friars preachers between 1220 and 1450. Across 230 years of a talkative, literate, argumentative order, no verifiable passage names Dominic as the author of the Rosary. Then there is the art, which is harder to explain away than the documents. Dominic's tomb at Bologna does not show it. Fra Angelico, a Dominican friar who spent his working life painting Dominicans, at the foot of the cross, in the cells at San Marco, in half the frescoes of 15th century Florence, never once put a rosary in his founder's hands. Herbert Thurston, the English Jesuit who lived from 1856 to 1939 and spent 45 years at Farm Street in London, taking pious traditions carefully apart, called this the conspiracy of silence. He was not being theatrical, he was describing a hole in the record shaped exactly like the thing that was supposed to be there. Now, silence alone proves less than people think. Records burn, orders lose their archives. A devotion can be practiced for 2 centuries before anybody bothers to write about it. So watch what happened when scholars went looking for something solid to fill the hole. That is where the story stops being an argument about missing evidence and becomes an argument about the evidence that was produced. A will was put forward, supposedly written by a man named Anthony Seurs, leaving a bequest to a confraternity of the Rosary at Palencia in the year 1221. It would have settled the question. Dominican authorities themselves now accept that it is a forgery. Memoirs surfaced from a certain Luminosi de Oposa, who claimed to have heard Dominic preach at Bologna. Alban Butler cited them. They have been shown to be fabricated. A fresco at Mure was invoked, showing Dominic with a rosary. The fresco no longer exists, and there is good reason to believe the beads were painted into it long after the original was made. Contemporary verses were quoted linking Dominic to a crown of roses. The manuscript has vanished, and the one man who actually saw it read not Dominicus but Dominus, not Dominic but the Lord. One letter, and the whole citation collapses. One more thing worth noticing about the story itself. The details move. Some tellings put Dominic in a forest, others in the church at Prul. The number of Aves shifts. The instructions Mary gives him vary from version to version. Accounts that descend from a single fixed revelation do not usually wobble like that. Follow every strand back, and they converge on one man in one decade, the decade we started in. Alain de la Roche, a Dominican working out of a friary at Douai, preaching through northern France and Flanders between roughly 1470 and 1475. Here is the part I find hardest to argue around. Alain claimed his account came from earlier writers, a Johannes de Monte, a Thomas de Templo. Those writers cannot be identified. Their books cannot be found. The 17th century Dominican bibliographers Quetif and Echard, cataloguing the writings of their own order, concluded that Alain had built his revelations on the imaginary testimony of authors who never existed. His defenders make a reasonable point in reply. Manuscripts were destroyed wholesale in the century that followed, and Alain's contemporaries, men who read his books and would have known, do not seem to have complained that the sources were missing. That deserves to be stated fairly rather than waved away. But it does not touch the central problem, and the central problem is not about Alain's honesty. Alain may have believed every word. The problem is that the thing he described as a gift handed over complete in a forest was, by the 15th century, already visibly assembled out of parts. And we can watch the parts arrive. One more detail before we go back to the beginning, because it says something about how the Church handles its own history. The most devastating demolition of the Dominic legend ever published in English appeared in the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1912. Thurston wrote it. It carries a nihil obstat and the imprimatur of the Archbishop of New York. The Church printed the case against its own most popular origin story, under its own authority, and then kept praying the Rosary. I think that is more admirable than the legend it dismantled. So where did it come from? Counting prayers on objects is older than the Rosary, older than the Hail Mary, older than the word Christian applied to anyone in Europe. Palladius records that Paul the Hermit, in the 4th century, set himself the task of 300 prayers a day, and kept count by gathering 300 pebbles and throwing one away at the end of each. A pile of stones on the desert floor, going down by one. The habit spread wherever the arithmetic got heavy. In 782, Pope Hadrian I granted a privilege to the monks of St. Apollinaris in Classe, requiring them, in gratitude, to say the Kyrie eleison 300 times, twice a day. 600 repetitions before nightfall. Nobody was tracking that on their fingers. In the Christian East, the same instinct produced the comboschini, the knotted wool rope still worn by Orthodox monks, on which the Jesus prayer is repeated. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That rope has no mysteries, no decades, no Marian content at all. It grew from the same root and went a different way, which is worth remembering the next time somebody calls prayer beads a Roman invention. None of that is the Rosary. Beads are only a counting device. What made the Rosary was what got counted, and to understand that you need one number, 150. The Psalter has 150 psalms. Monastic life was built on getting through all of them, and by long tradition the book was divided into 350s, so consistently that the divisions are marked, in the great illuminated psalters, by full-page miniatures at the first psalm, the 51st and the 101st. In penitential codes and monastic documents across early medieval England and Ireland, you find monks assigned 250s or 350s as a matter of routine. In the Irish houses, the whole 150 could be the daily burden of every monk, recited from memory, often alongside hundreds of prostrations. Which raises an obvious problem. What do you do about the brothers who cannot read? Monasteries had them in large numbers. The convocii, the lay brothers who did the farming, and the building and the hauling, while the choir monks sang the office. They were bound to the community's prayers for the dead. They could not perform them. The customs of Cluny, collected by Udalric in 1096, give the solution in a single flat sentence. When a brother died, every priest was to offer Mass, and every man who was not a priest was to say 50 psalms, or to repeat the Lord's Prayer 50 times. Read that substitution again, because everything else follows from it. 50. Our fathers stand in for 50 psalms, not as a devotion in their own right, as a stand-in. 150 Our Fathers were the poor man's psalter, and the Church said so openly in writing, before anyone had thought of the Rosary as a distinct thing at all. The Knights Templar, whose rule dates from around 1128, worked the same way. Knights who could not attend choir owed 57 Lord's Prayers. When a brother died, they owed 100 a day for a week. Picture a monastery with a stone staircase running up the outside wall to the chapel door. The choir monks climb it every day, carved, ancient, difficult, beautiful. The lay brothers cannot use it because the staircase is made of Latin. So somebody hangs a knotted rope down the same wall. Same wall, same door, same floor at the top. Just a way up for the people who could not manage the steps. The Rosary is the rope, and here is the thing about ropes. They are portable. Within 400 years the rope had been taken down off the wall, carried out of the monastery, into the fields and the shops and the bedrooms of Europe, and hung on walls the monks had never seen, while the stone staircase stayed exactly where it was, used by fewer and fewer people every century. You can still hear the original purpose in what medieval Europe called the beads. They were not called rosaries. They were called paternosters. The evidence for this is overwhelming, and it comes from everywhere. By the 13th century, the men who made them were a recognized craft, the paternosterers. The Livre des Métiers, compiled by Étienne Boileau in Paris in 1268, records 4 separate guilds of paternosters working in the city. Their London counterparts clustered in a street that is still on the map. It is called Paternoster Row. You do not name an entire industry after a prayer that nobody is counting on your product. The oldest clear description of the object in England is stranger and earlier than most people expect. Around 1075, the Countess Godiva of Coventry, the same Godiva, though the ride through the streets is a much later legend, left in her will a circlet of precious stones, which she had threaded on a cord in order to count her prayers exactly. William of Malmesbury records it. She died roughly a century and a half before Dominic was born, and whatever she was counting, it was not Hail Marys. because the Hail Mary was not yet in general devotional use. The word we use gives the same answer. Our English bead comes from the Old English ged, which simply means a prayer, the same root that gives us bid, as in to bid someone farewell, originally to entreat. The little balls of bone and amber took the name of the thing they were counting. Chaucer's Prioress carries a pair of beads, gauded owl with green. Shakespeare's holy men are at their beads, meaning at their prayers. To tell your beads never meant to touch the objects. It meant to count the prayers. We now use a word for jewelry that started life as a word for asking God for something. The object swallowed the prayer's name and kept it, so the beads are older than Dominic, and they were built for the Our Father, which leaves the question of when Mary entered the count, and the answer is later than almost anyone assumes, and in a form most Catholics today would not recognize as the Hail Mary at all. The prayer begins as 2 verses of Luke and nothing else. The angel's greeting in Luke 1 verse 28, Elizabeth's cry in Luke 1 verse 42. Joined together they make one sentence, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. Those 2 verses are the whole prayer. Stop there. There is no petition. There is no request. There is nothing addressed to Mary as an intercessor at all. Go to the Greek, and the point sharpens considerably. Gabriel says chair kecharitomene. Chair is not a formal salute. It is the ordinary Greek word for rejoice. The thing you said to someone when you met them, the way we say hello without hearing the health in it. And kecharitomene is a perfect passive participle built on charis, grace, the same charis buried inside the word Eucharist. The perfect tense in Greek describes an action completed in the past whose effect is standing there in the present. Put plainly, rejoice you who have already been graced and still are. That is a piece of news being announced. It is not a petition being submitted. For the first 1,000 years of Christian history, and well beyond, when a believer said the Ave, they were not asking Mary for anything. They were repeating the angel's announcement back into the room, the way you repeat astonishing news to yourself to make it feel real. The prayer accumulated by inches. Elizabeth's words were joined to Gabriel's by around the year 1000. The name Jesus was attached to the end of the phrase about the fruit of the womb roughly 2 centuries later, possibly under Pope Urban IV, who reigned from 1261 to 1264, though that attribution is not certain, and people were already saying it in 50s. The biographer of St. Albert, who died in 1140, records that his subject genuflected 100 times a day and prostrated himself 50 times, saying the short Ave at each one. And the biographer writes out every word of it, which suggests his readers might not have known it by heart. The Ancrene Ryle, an English guide for anchresses, written no later than around 1200, instructs its readers in 50 aves divided into sets of 10. Sets of 10, in an English corner, 20 years before the Dominicans arrived in the country. By the early 13th century, the Beguines of Ghent were praying 3 such chains of 50 every day. 3 50s, always the same number, always shadowing the psalter. That leaves the second half of the prayer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. And its history is the single fact from all of this that most surprises people who have prayed it every day of their lives. It is late. It is very late, and its earliest appearances in print are not in a papal decree or a mystic's vision. A French edition of the Calendar of Shepherds, printed in 1493, carries a third part attached to the Hail Mary. Richard Pinson's English translation reproduces it a few years afterwards in the spelling of the day. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. That book was a popular almanac. Weather signs, saints' days, health advice, the labours of the months. The petition half of the world's most recited Marian prayer surfaces, first in something close to a farmer's yearbook. 2 years later, in 1495, the Ave appears in the form we now use. Missing only the single word ours from at the hour of our death, printed at the head of a short work by Girolamo Savonarola. Sit with that for a moment. The Dominican firebrand of Florence, who 3 years afterwards was hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria as a heretic, gives us one of the earliest printed witnesses to the prayer that 1 billion people now say without thinking. Official standardization came later still. Pope Pius V fixed the form in his Reformed Breviary in 1568 in the wake of the Council of Trent, which means the petition Catholics recite 53 times in a single rosary is younger than the printing press. Its first known appearance in print comes the year after Columbus sailed. Its official form is younger than the Reformation it is sometimes used to argue against. One more component had to arrive before the thing became recognizable, and it is the component John Paul II would later call the essence of the whole exercise. The Meditations. Around 1409, a young man from near Danzig entered the Carthusian charter house of St. Alban at Trier and took the name Dominic, not the Dominic. Dominic of Prussia, born in 1384, died in 1460, a monk of no fame whatsoever outside the walls of his own order. He had a problem, and he wrote about it honestly. His house prayed the Marian Psalter, the 150 Aves, and he found the repetition unbearable. His mind wandered. The words went dead in his mouth. His prior, Adolf of Essen, gave him a piece of practical advice that changed Western devotion permanently. Write a short phrase for each Ave. Clip it onto the end, after the name of Jesus, so that every repetition carries a scene with it. Dominic wrote 50 of them. They are called clausulae, little closing clauses. Jesus, whom you conceived by the Holy Spirit at the angel's announcement. Jesus, who after long prayer in the garden sweated drops of blood. The avenue stops being a phrase you repeat and becomes a frame you look through, 50 times, at 50 different moments in the life of Christ. The exact years are uncertain. The sources place the composition somewhere between 1409 and 1415, and some push the finished collection into the 1430s. What is not uncertain is the direction of influence. Meditation on the mysteries entered the Rosary from a Carthusian cell in the Rhineland, 200 years after Dominic de Guzman was in the ground. Thurston floated a suggestion I have never been able to shake. 2 men named Dominic, both associated with 150 Aves, one obscure and one enormously famous. It would not be the first time a tradition attached itself to the better-known name. Now put the pieces on the table. Beads from the desert and the monasteries. 150 repetitions from the Psalter. The Our Father from the Lay Brothers. The Avenue from Luke and 11th century popular piety. Meditations from Trier. 5 components, 5 different centuries, 5 different sets of hands. What turned that pile of parts into a fixed object was not an apparition. It was a machine. In 1483, in the German city of Ulm, the printer Konrad Dinkmat produced a book called Unser lieben Frauen Psalter, Our Lady's Psalter. Inside was a set of crude woodcut diagrams by an artist whose name we do not have. The images divided the 150 Aves and 15 Our Fathers into 3 groups coded by color: white roses, red roses, gold roses. Each group broke into 5 roundels of 10 roses, and inside each roundel sat a simple picture of a scene from the life of Jesus and Mary. Joyful, sorrowful, glorious. 14 of those 15 pictures correspond to the mysteries Catholics pray today. Consider what a woodcut does that a manuscript cannot. It repeats, identically, cheaply, in thousands. Before printing, the meditations attached to the Aves varied enormously from house to house and from country to country. The Dominicans themselves were not agreed on them at the end of the 15th century. Afterwards, everyone had the same 15 pictures. I would go further than most accounts do here. The 15 mysteries were not decreed, revealed, or defined. They were, in effect, standardized by a print shop in a Swabian town because the woodblocks were cut and the woodblocks did not change. The organization arrived at the same moment as the Standardization, and it moved with a speed that is difficult to imagine now. Alain de la Roche founded his Confraternity of the Psalter of the Glorious Virgin Mary at Douai in 1470. Jakob Sprenger, a Dominican at Cologne, established a rival body. He insisted on the word rosary, where Alain had preferred psalter, in either 1474 or 1475, depending on which source you follow. Papal approval came in 1478. Membership was free. There were no dues, no attendance, no obligations beyond saying the prayers and having your name entered in a register. What you received in exchange was indulgences and a share in the merits of everyone else enrolled, including, crucially, on behalf of the dead. You could sign up your late mother. The numbers are disputed, and some of them are clearly inflated, but every account agrees on the shape. Tens of thousands in months, well over 100,000 within a decade, spread to Italy, France, the Low Countries and Portugal by the year 1500. The Emperor Frederick III was enrolled. A priest in London wrote to a patron in Yorkshire in 1486 to say he had registered the man's name, and his lady's, with the Rosary of Our Lady of Cologne. Here is the mechanism that turned a legend into a fact, and it is depressingly ordinary. When a confraternity applied to Rome for indulgences, the promoters supplied the historical background themselves. Rome granted the indulgence and repeated the background in the grant. The grant then circulated as papal confirmation of the history the promoters had written. The earliest bulls still show a little daylight. Leo X, in Pastoris Eterni in 1520, attributes the Rosary to Dominic with the qualifier prout in Historias Legiuta, as is read in the histories. That is a scholar's hedge. It says, "This is what the accounts say. Later popes dropped the hedge. By 1569 the hedge was gone entirely, and the man who removed it had a reason. Pius V was a Dominican. He had worn the habit since boyhood. On the 17th of September 1569 he issued Consueverant Romani Pontifices, the document. That locked the Rosary into the shape the Church would use for the next 433 years, 150 Aves, 15 Our Fathers, meditations throughout. The bull states plainly that Dominic looked to this way of praying, and it explains the number in a way no historian would dispute. 150, it says, according to the number of the Davidic Psalter. 2 years later, on the 7th of October 1571, the fleets of the Holy League and the Ottoman Empire met in the Gulf of Patras, and the Christian side won. Pius attributed the victory to the Rosary campaign he had called across Europe, and instituted a feast of Our Lady of Victory, soon renamed the Feast of the Holy Rosary. It sits on the 7th of October still. Lepanto did what no bull could. It fused the devotion to a date, a battle, and a miracle, and it made questioning the origin story feel like questioning the deliverance. 3 centuries on, Leo XIII wrote more about the Rosary than any pope in history. A series of encyclicals beginning with Supremi Apostolatus Officio on the 1st of September 1883. Every one of them assumes the institution of the Rosary by Dominic as established historical fact. 29 years after that first encyclical, the Catholic Encyclopedia published Thurston's article demonstrating that it was not. Both documents were Catholic. Both had ecclesiastical approval. They contradict each other completely, and the Church went on functioning, which tells you something true, and often forgotten about how much weight a devotional legend is actually asked to carry. Then, quietly, in 2002, a pope settled it, and I do not think one Catholic in 1,000 noticed. On the 16th of October, John Paul II issued Rosarium Virginis Mariae, the most substantial papal document on the Rosary in more than 400 years. It runs to 43 sections. It discusses the beads, the mysteries, the repetition, the Hail Mary, the history, Lourdes, Fatima, Bartolo Longo, Louis XIII, Padre Pio. Saint Dominic is not named once. The opening sentence says the Rosary gradually took form in the 2nd millennium. Later, explaining why the mysteries are the ones they are, the letter states that the selection was determined by the origin of the prayer, which was based on the number 150, the number of the Psalms in the Psalter. That is the Psalter thesis, in a papal document, in the Pope's own voice, not smuggled in by a skeptic, set down as the plain account of where the thing came from. And in the same letter, he did something no pope had dared. He proposed 5 new mysteries, the luminous mysteries, the public ministry of Jesus, from the Jordan to the upper room. By adding them, he broke the number 150 for the first time since the lay brothers of Cluny started substituting Our Fathers for Psalms 900 years earlier. You can only do that if you know the number was never sacred. It was a borrowed measurement. John Paul II knew exactly what he was holding, and he adjusted it, and he told everyone why. There is a second audience for all of this, and they should not be allowed to leave feeling comfortable. Protestants have dismissed the Rosary for 5 centuries as vain repetition, usually citing the warning in Matthew 6 verse 7 against heaping up empty phrases. It is a fair thing to raise. Paul VI raised it himself in 1974, warning that without contemplation the Rosary is a body without a soul. But notice what the objection is actually aimed at. Once you know the history, the skeleton is the 150 Psalms, the same Psalms Protestants sing, print in the back of their hymnals, and read in course. The core text is 2 verses of Luke, quoted more or less verbatim. The meditations are scenes from the Gospels. Martin Luther knew this perfectly well. In his personal prayer book of 1522, he kept the Hail Mary, the short one, the scriptural one, without the petition, and told his readers that the words were not a prayer of request at all, but pure praise and honor. He rejected the invocation of the saints and said so bluntly. He did not reject the angel's greeting, because he could read where it came from. So the honest position on both sides is narrower than the shouting suggests. The disputed material in the Rosary is real, and it is roughly 2 lines long, and it arrived in the 15th century. Everything else is the Psalter, Luke, and the life of Christ. Now step back as far as you can and look at what actually happened. Walk high enough into the mountains and you find cairns. Nobody designed them. No architect drew one. Each traveller who came through the pass added a stone. partly to mark the way for whoever came next. After 1,000 years of walkers, there is a monument standing on the ridge that looks entirely deliberate, so deliberate that people start telling stories about who built it, and when, and what they saw when they did. The Rosary is a cairn. A hermit in the Egyptian desert put down a pebble. Irish monks counted out their 350s in the dark. A lay brother at Cluny, who could not read a word, said the Our Father 50 times for a man who had died. Somebody in Coventry threaded jewels on a cord. Ancresses in an English cell said their Aves in tens. Begwines in Ghent said 150. A Carthusian at Trier, bored and honest about it, wrote 50 short sentences to hold his mind still. A printer in Ulm cut 15 pictures into wood. A Dominican in Douai told a story about a forest that made all of it feel like a gift rather than an accumulation. Every one of them added a stone. Not one of them was building what we ended up with. I understand why the legend won. An accumulation has no author you can thank, no moment you can paint, no feast you can keep. A vision in a forest has all three. Legends are simply easier to love than centuries. But consider what the legend costs. If the Rosary dropped out of heaven complete in 1214, then it is a private gift to one order, and its authority rests on whether a particular apparition happened. If it grew, then it is something else entirely, a 1,000-year record of ordinary Christians who could not read the psalter and refused to be shut out of the Church's prayer, and who built themselves a way in, one stone at a time, out of the only materials they had. That is not a smaller story, that is the doctrine of the whole Church at prayer, demonstrated in wood and bone and knotted cord, by people whose names are gone. The Rosary did not come down from heaven, it came up from the Psalms. And the next time you hold one, or see one on somebody else's wrist on a bus, which in this part of the world is not rare, it is worth remembering what you are looking at, not a relic of one saint's vision. A cairn built by illiterate farmhands, desert hermits, English recluses, a homesick monk in the Rhineland, and an anonymous woodcutter in Ulm. None of whom knew each other, all of whom were reaching for the same 150 psalms they had been told they could not have. If you pray it, you are not repeating somebody's private revelation. You are standing in a queue that stretches back to a man in the Egyptian sand with a heap of stones at his feet, and you are putting down your own. If you know the real story of another devotion that has quietly been replaced by a better-told legend, put it in the comments. I read them, and the Church has more of these than anyone admits.